Alright, what's up everybody? Today we're going to talk about animating effects inside of Adobe Premiere. So the first thing you'll need to do is open up the effects panel. And like everything in Premiere, the effects panel lives in multiple places. Probably the best choice would be to come over here to the right and use the workspace drop-down and open up the effects workspace. And what that does is it gives you all of your video effects, audio effects, transitions, and a few presets right here in this folder. Our video effects all live right there, and they're broken into individual folders by their group. But if you decide you don't want to use that window, you do have a secondary effects option, and that is over here in your project window in the lower left. You'll notice that it doesn't show right now, but if I go up to Window and I click on the Effects workspace, it will open up. Put a check mark next to it. It will give me access to the folder right here in my project window. Now, it's totally up to you which one you decide to use. It's also worth mentioning that if that is closed, you can also hit Shift 7, and that will open up the effects panel in your project window. So that's how you get to your effects panel. And then let's go ahead and switch over to the effects workspace and open up video effects. So rather than going through every effect in here and showing you how to animate, what I've really discovered is that animating effects inside of Premiere is very intuitive. It's really just a matter of knowing the tools that you have to work with. So we'll go through the basic tools, things like keyframes, adjusting the effect position, using color pickers, and then I'll show you how to apply a mask to limit the area that your effect is affecting. So let's go ahead and jump in. So we have this first image here, and for this image, let's just start with a very basic effect. If we come over to Blur and Sharpen and choose a Gaussian blur, we can apply that to this image. Now I know I'm using images here, but you can apply effects to video clips or images, and they essentially work the exact same way. So if I were to grab a blur, like a Gaussian blur, and drag it down and apply it to this image right here, you'll notice that as soon as I drop it on this clip, it shows up in my effect control window for that clip. It's also worth mentioning that if you select a clip and then double click on an effect, it will apply the effect that way. Once you've added an effect to a clip, you can toggle its visibility using this FX tab right here. So if I crank up the blur value and I want to keep this effect, but I want to disable it, I can click Effects, and that turns off the effect but doesn't remove it from my effects control window. This is great if you have an effect that's slowing down your playback and you want to be able to edit without removing the effect, and then at the end, before you export, you can go in and turn on all of your effects. Beyond that, it's also worth mentioning that you can copy and paste effects. So if I select it and hit Command C on a Mac, Control C on a PC, I can go over to the next image, select that, and hit Command V to paste that effect. So working with effects is pretty straightforward and pretty intuitive once you're familiar with all the tools at your disposal. At this point, let's go ahead and animate this effect. Think of it as having a starting line and a finish line. To create the starting line, I need to come over and decide where I want the animation to begin. I'll go ahead and set it at 1 second. And it's worth mentioning that this current time indicator is exactly the same as the one on our timeline. I'm going to start my animation at 1 second. And in this case, I want the photo to be blurry. We're going to start out blurry and slowly come into focus. So if I come over here to the blurriness parameter, I can see there's only one value that I can adjust numerically. You'll also notice there's a drop down next to it. If I hit the drop down, that's going to give me a slider, which is nice, but the reality is I can just click on this number, and if I hold down the mouse, I can drag my mouse left or right, and it essentially works just like a slider. Let's go ahead and start off at 1 second. Let's crank the blurry value up to something pretty high, something like, let's go to 50. Now, of course, you can also just double click on this and type in a number if you have a value in mind. And so I've gone ahead and put the playhead where I wanted the animation to start. I've got the image looking the way I want it to look. So I can go ahead and add a keyframe by clicking the stopwatch. There's my starting line. So that's how it's going to start. And if I do nothing else at this point, we won't see any change. In order to create an animation, we need to have 2 points to animate between. This one says start at 1 second and be very blurry. Let's go ahead and drag it to 2 seconds and set it all the way back to 0. Now again, there's really 3 ways to do this. I could click on it and drag it to 0. I could click on the number itself and type in 0. Or I can use this reset parameter control right here and say I have this at 60. If I hit this button, it will reset it down to 0. This is a really handy button. It just saves you a lot of keystrokes. So at this point, we have the image at 1 second with a blur value of 50, and then at 2 seconds down to 0. So essentially our image is coming into focus, and if we play it back, it looks great. Now again, with keyframes, remember, you can play with the timing of these. If I want this to take longer, I could take that first keyframe and drag it back to the beginning, and now it's going to take 2 seconds for that image to come into focus. Now, you'll notice there's a couple additional parameters down here. There's blur vertical and horizontal, which basically blurs it in all directions. But if I want to create a feeling of horizontal motion, I could set it to horizontal, and now it kind of feels like a motion blur. Beyond that, we also have the option to repeat edge pixels. And this is something that's sort of specific to blurs. Essentially what can happen, and I'm not really seeing it on this image, but if you turn this off, sometimes you'll notice almost like an embossing effect on the photo. And you might notice a little softness or lack of pixels along the edge. If you keep this clicked, it will solve that problem. Again, not any real reason to animate it in this case, but you could. So anything that has a stopwatch next to it, you could animate. In this case, we'll just do the blurring and unblurring of the image. Let's move on to another one. So let's go down to the distort category. Let's pick something like mirror effect. So if we grab this one and we drag it down, you'll notice that we've got essentially mirror angle, and then we've got the reflection center. And this is what I was talking about earlier with effect position. So if I go ahead and crank up the value of this mirror effect, you can see what's happening. It's starting to create a mirrored image that is essentially reflecting my image. But you'll also notice that if I play around with this number, you can see it's kind of pivoting up from the right-hand side. And if for any reason that's not where you want it, that's where the reflection center will come into play. So notice that as I move this, it's sort of moving that initial position of where the reflection is coming from, and I'm getting completely different results. A lot of these effects, you can change the value of the effect and the amount of the effect, but you can also change where the effect takes place. Again, I have an X slider for my X value and a Y slider for my Y value. If I go to a number like 90, it's a little bit easier to see what's going on. Again, these are the two most common things you will find when you are working with effects. Now let's talk about the next one. In fact, let's go to something like channel. I'm going to go ahead and just delete this off of here by just selecting mirror and hitting delete. And now let's look at something like channel. If I choose channel, you'll notice there's only one option under there, and it's called invert. And if I drag this down, you'll see that it inverts the color channels. It essentially looks at the color wheel, and whatever color is on the opposite side, that's what you get. So if you looked at a color wheel, you would see that the opposite of yellow is blue. You can see that it's doing some color effects. And if we go over here and we look at our options here, we see that we have a few choices. We have the ability to change the channel. So right now it's looking at RGB, but if we wanted to just look at the red channel, we could do that. Or just look at the blue channel. Or just look at the lightness, for example, and invert the saturation, so making the darker areas lighter and the lighter areas darker. And then we have this blend with original. Now this is a really cool option because it basically just reduces the amount of the effect and allows you to kind of blend it with the original image. It's almost like an opacity slider for the effect. But there's also these three options up here, and these are what I want to talk about now. These are masks, and what they're going to do is they're going to limit the area that your effect is affecting. So for example, if I take the ellipse mask and I just click on it, it's automatically going to drop it on my screen. And you'll notice that we get control points that we can use to change the size of it. I can grab any of these control points and stretch this effect out. You'll also notice over here there's this little sort of pull tab, and if I pull on that, that'll adjust the feather of the effect. I can also scale it up, and you can see that now we have this effect, if I click off of it, with a softened edge right in the middle of our photo. And it's really a great tool for creativity and for limiting effects to certain spots, but you might not want this effect to work this way. You might want the opposite. And if we come over here, as soon as we add the mask to our effect, we now have controls for that mask. If I click on the mask path, you can see it brings back the path of the mask. I could track this to the image using the track select forward buttons. I could feather this more or less using the numeric pad over here. I can adjust its opacity, which is kind of like blending with the original. And finally, I have the option to adjust its expansion, which just makes the mask bigger or smaller. If it turns out you've drawn the mask a little bit too small, this is an easy way to stretch it out. But what might be one of the most important settings is the option to invert this effect. Notice how the mask is keeping the effect inside the mask. If I invert it, it'll put the effect outside the mask. Now again, since all of these have stopwatches next to them, I can animate all of these parameters. Let's go ahead and just animate the expansion by clicking and adding a keyframe in the beginning and then pulling the playhead forward. Let's go forward 1 second, and let's increase the expansion off the screen. And as you can see, if you were building a title sequence or wanted to do some interesting animation, that would be a nice tool to have access to. So those are essentially the tools we have. Let's take a look at just a couple more here. Let's come over to our video clip here. Now, this is interesting. This video clip is a 4K clip in a 1080 timeline. There is a really cool effect under Transform called Auto Reframe. Now, if I just click on this and drag this onto my layer, it will automatically reframe the layer to fit in this window. But the fact is, this can do a whole lot more. Auto Reframe is designed to allow you to reframe video clips for social media, for things like a 9:16 aspect ratio. With one click, it allows you to quickly fit anything to the existing window. And now let's go up to something like, let's look at something like Adjust. If we go up to Adjust, we'll see that there's the option to do lighting effects. Now, this is a little bit more sophisticated of an effect, but it uses all of the same controls we're familiar with. If I grab this lighting effect and I drag it onto my clip, you'll notice that we get this real nice highlight right in the middle of our shot. In fact, what we're actually getting is 5 optional lights. And so right now, only one of them is turned on. If we drop that down, we'll notice that light number 1 is set to a spotlight. Now we can change the color using the color picker by either using the eyedropper and selecting a color from our image. Now it's selected that dark blue. Or we can click right in this box and pick any color that we want. Not sure if green is the optimal color, but who knows? Maybe you're getting an alien visitor. And so beyond that, you'll see that we can change the center. This is the effect position. So we could drag it over here, or we could drag it over there, or more importantly, we could animate it. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's drag the playhead back to the beginning of the clip. We'll drag the light all the way to the left, so it's barely on screen. We'll add a keyframe for center, and then we'll drag the playhead forward and simply slide that value over to the right. And essentially we have created this sweeping light that now will animate across our image. And again, it's a little heavy-handed, it's not blended very well, but you get the idea that it's very easy to make things move in Premiere. And then what you might opt to do would be to play with the angle and the radius or even the focus to try to get something a little more interesting than just a light moving straight across your screen. And what I generally recommend doing is just coming up here and dragging around these values to see what they do. You can always hit the reset button if you don't like it. And as you can see here, we can create some interesting animations by playing with the minor radius value. We can play with the angle as well. And in this case, maybe coming over from this side and cranking up that radius value might give us something interesting. Let's drop that back down a little bit. And we could take that back to the beginning and hit the space bar. And as you can see, with a little bit of time and effort, you could probably turn that into something pretty cool and pretty effective. At the end of the day, it's relatively easy to do this. And just like everything, we do have mask controls. So if I did, for some reason, want to limit that to a smaller area of the image, I could do that. As you can see, there we go. I could soften it up, make it look a little bit more like I don't know, soft light. And as you can see now, there's that control, there's that effect moving across our screen. So I could turn that into a softer little swath of light right there. But what you need to remember for this is that the image is animated, but the mask is not. So if I have an animated image, you'll notice right here we're seeing darkness because the green is still over here. And you'll see that it kind of comes into the mask and then goes past the mask. So if we wanted to, we could animate the mask to move with the effect. Let's go ahead and go over to the mask path. Let's go back to the very beginning. And let's slide that path all the way over to the left. And we'll see that over here, we're seeing that green. I could then click the stopwatch for the mask path and slide the playhead to where the animation ends and then move the mask to match it. There's our mask. So I'm just going to simply grab the mask and drag it all the way to the right. And if I do this right, we should be able to keep that mask over the lighting effect. So now if we drag it back and hit the space bar, we'll let this play. Now you notice I'm getting this red line on my timeline. That's Premiere telling me it would like me to render this effect. And if you want to render an effect without rendering your entire timeline, the best way to do it is to click right up here in the numbers and hit the I key. And that creates an in point. And then if I go to the end of the clip and hit the O key, that creates an out point. So now if I hit the return key, it's going to render that effect. And the nice thing is you can do this one effect at a time. You don't have to render the entire timeline if you don't want to. Just know that if I go in and adjust any of those values on the effect on the effects control panel, that I will have to render this again. So if you don't have to render, it's not a bad idea to just play it back. You can even come over here and drop your playback resolution so that it has an easier time playing. But if you have a fast enough machine and it renders quick enough, then there's nothing wrong with rendering your clip so that Premiere can play it back smoothly. But right here, we can drop the playback resolution, and that will help Premiere playback effects more smoothly. So that's essentially it. Let's take a look at one more effect, because this is an effect that we use all the time that is unlike any other effect, and that's the warped stabilizer. Now, I'm not going to go through all the settings, but if you go to the Distort folder and you come down to Warp Stabilizer, and if we look right here, I have a somewhat shaky shot using a macro lens of a bee on a flower that is being blown around in the wind. Not to mention, I am rocking back and forth trying to keep focus. If we come over here and grab the Warp Stabilizer and just drag it onto this clip, it's going to start analyzing in the background. Now, the nice thing about that is I can continue to work. You'll also notice that it's going really fast if we look over here. So now it's stabilizing this clip. And one thing that I can tell you is it has punched in on this clip. It is zoomed in order to create a stabilized clip. And if we look back at it now, it really did a nice job. Occasionally you can end up with warping or some really unattractive issues with this, but in this case the movement was slow enough and smooth enough that it had no problem smoothing out the motion. And as far as options in here, really the only thing you would probably want to mess with is if you don't want to smooth the motion, you want to actually create a locked off shot, you can choose no motion. If you're using a long lens and you're just recording something far away, there might be some shake in there. So no motion might be the option you'd go for there. In this case, I like the smooth motion. As far as the methods, subspace warp is almost always going to be your best bet. And you generally don't have any reason to play with the borders. It is worth noticing down here though, under auto scale, that it has scaled this up to 113%, which isn't terribly noticeable because this video is pretty soft to begin with. But for certain footage, it might scale it up to 150 or 160%. And if that's the case, you might want to come in here and set a maximum scale value. Because if video is scaled to 150%, it does tend to get soft. All right, let's just take a look at a couple more effects here. So I have this really cool image right here that I got from pexels.com. Now, I want to show you kind of a specific effect here. We'll go to Stylize and we'll go to Mosaic. If I grab Mosaic, what it does is it essentially turns this into larger pixels, essentially. You'll notice that right now it's taken this entire image and it has converted it into 10 blocks of width and 10 blocks of height. And if I click Sharp Colors, you notice that it makes the colors a little more punchy. I think you can kind of see that as I drag these around, it kind of looks like a pixelized glitch effect. So if we wanted to play with this, how could we turn this into a glitch effect on this cool looking spiral? Well, let me show you. I want this effect to look as good as possible when I start. So I'm going to set it up to 1,000 blocks. So I'm going to type in here, set that to 1,000. Type in here, set that to 1,000 as well. And while it's not as smooth as the actual original image, it's pretty close. Since essentially I have this looking like it almost as good as it does. In fact, let's go ahead and just type in 2,000. So now this image doesn't look very different. In fact, it looks almost exactly the same as it does without the effect. So I'm going to add a keyframe for horizontal and vertical. And then I'm going to move the playhead forward 10 frames. So I'm going to hold Shift and hit the right arrow to jump forward 10 frames. And then I want to drop this down to something like 50. And I'm going to do that to both the numeric values. And since I moved the playhead forward and I changed the value, we got another set of keyframes. So, just like always, we have our starting point where we're at 2,000. We have a short 10 frames before we get down to 50. And essentially we have a start and a finish line. Now, if I want this to continue going, I can create new finish lines and it will essentially continue to animate that way. So what I could do here is I could jump forward another 10 frames by holding down Shift and using the right arrow key. And I could either set this back to 2,000 or, even easier, I could just select the original keyframes that were valued at 2,000, as you can see here, and I could just paste those in right here. If you select them and hit Command C, that will copy those keyframes. If I hit Command V, that will paste those keyframes. And notice we're back to essentially where we started. If we back up, we have that. Now that is a glitch effect. Again, the cool thing about this now is that now that we have a start and a finish, we can copy all of these keyframes, Command C, and if we wanted to, we could just continue to paste them throughout the rest of this image. And essentially, we're going to create a glitching image. If we look at this, you see it works pretty well. Now, I wouldn't necessarily recommend just using that same 50 value. What I might opt to do is go to this set of keyframes, and notice we're at 50. But if I use the arrows and I jump past these 2000s and I go to the next set of 50 keyframes, I might change this down to 5 and maybe set the vertical to 15. And now our glitch is going to be different each time. Or at least you can create some variety. So again, all you do is find the ones that are valued at 50, use these arrows to jump, then jump to the next group, maybe set these to, let's try 75, and we'll set the horizontal to 45, and then we'll jump forward to the next group. Let's say 50, we'll change this to 80, change this one to 4, and get that last group right there, and we'll change that one to, I don't know, whatever, 100, and we'll set that to 111. And now if we play through this, we've created a variety of different quick glitch effects, which again, with some little effort and some time, could be turned into something pretty cool and usable. Okay, we got one final effect to look at. So we've got this mugshot of yours truly right here. And we are going to have a little fun. The way we're going to do that is by going to Distort and choosing an effect like Sphere Eyes. So essentially, if we add Sphere Eyes and we come over to Radius and crank up the value, you can see that it essentially creates this fisheye bulging effect. Now this is where a little bit of creativity can end up creating something kind of interesting. So let's go ahead and bulge that out a little bit. Okay, now we can see where the effect is happening. Let's sort of try to put it over an eyeball. And then we'll back it off a little bit, make sure that it's pretty much sitting right over the eyeball. And while we're here, let's go ahead and animate it. So we'll start by clicking on the radius, and we'll drag the playhead forward a little bit. I wanted it to be at 0, but now I want it to be, let's crank it up to, say, about 142. So I've basically created this animation where the eyeball grows and bulges. Now, if we want to do that to both eyeballs, we can grab this Sphere Eyes effect, click on the word Sphere Eyes, hit Command C, Command V, and that will copy and paste that effect. And notice that now it's doing double on that one eye. But if I come over to the bottom effect and I use the center of sphere, I can move the second one over to the other eyeball and essentially create that, which again isn't gonna, win any VFX awards, but the fact is it's a funny effect that you can build in just a few seconds using some of the effects inside of Adobe Premiere. All right, let's grab one more effect and drag it over to our face here. We'll drag down a wave warp effect, and you'll notice that this kind of creates this distortion of like a wave, an audio wave or something going through your image. And I actually like what it's doing here, and you'll notice that it animates, so I don't even have to add any keyframes. It automatically sends this wave. So if I wanted to, without really doing anything to this, I could just grab a ellipse mask, but in this case, let's use the hand-drawn Bezier mask. So now I'm going to actually use this pen tool and draw on a mask myself and just do it around the mouth. And now if we click off and let this play back, you will see that we have a ridiculous animation. But an animation that, given the fact that it doesn't take much time to create, is not all that bad. So that is animating inside of Premiere. Remember, keyframes, color pickers, and effect positions are going to be your main controls for adjusting most of the effects inside of Premiere. And then using masks will allow you to control where in the image the effect is actually taking place. So I hope you had a little fun and learned something here in this lesson. If you haven't checked out the lesson on animating in Premiere, we go over animating video clips and photographs and general keyframe information. So check that video out if you haven't. We'll be doing a short video on animating text coming up soon. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel. It'll help me to create more videos and hopefully help you to become a better digital artist. Thanks for watching.